Hello everyone. This is the third part of the lecture material on the classical model. In this lecture video, we shall be talking about the classical theory of saving, investment and interest rate. How the interest rate is determined in the classical theory. Moreover, how does the interest rate play a stabilizing role in the classical model. Then we shall be moving on to the two lines of defense in the classical model. Finally, we shall be checking whether overproduction is possible in the classical model. Specifically, we shall be checking whether supply creates its own demand in the classical model. The classical theory of saving, investment and interest rate starts in the market for loanable fund. Individuals will not spend the entire part of their income to purchase the consumer goods. Rather, they will save a part of it, and this saving will appear as a supply of loanable fund in the market. On the other hand, there will be firms who will be creating a demand for the loanable fund for financing their investment projects. In this way, the saving function and the investment function will be determined and specified in the market for loanable fund. The interaction of saving and investment will determine the interest rate in the classical model. In the classical system, we assume that there is only one type of security or only one type of the asset, which is the perpetual bond. Bonds are of different types. From a bond, we can get two types of sources of earning. The bonds pay regular coupon or interest payments. On the maturity, the face value of the bond is paid back, so that the coupon payment and the payment of the principal amount on maturity are the two sources of earning from any kind of bond. In the classical model, we assume that the bonds have no maturity period, so that they will be paying the coupons for an infinite time period. These types of bonds are called the perpetual bonds. In United Kingdom, a perpetual bond was immensely popular, which was known as consol. Therefore, often these perpetual bonds are termed as consol. So, in the classical model, no fund will be raised through equity. So, either the fund is borrowed from the market or the fund is made available through the direct investment in the physical capital. Secondly, we assume that there is no resale market for old or the existing bonds. Therefore, any bond that is purchased is essentially a newly issued bond. Thirdly, no financial intermediaries exist in the market for loanable fund. Bonds are then sold directly by the firms to the individuals who seek to purchase those. And finally, we assume that there will be no commercial banks, or at least none with fractional reserves. With these assumptions at the back of our mind, we can now derive the investment function and the saving function in the market for loanable fund. In the classical model, the firms are the suppliers of the bonds. They borrow funds or they create demand for the loanable fund. The firms borrow or they issue the bonds in order to finance their investment expenditure. Government might also sell bonds to finance its deficit. The government deficit is the difference between the government revenue and the government expenditure. A part of this deficit may be financed by issuing bonds to the public. Now, it is evident that this deficit itself and the portion of the deficit that is decided by the government to be financed by selling bonds to the public are exogenously given policy variables. In the classical model, the level of business investment is a function of two things. Number one, it depends on the expected profitability of the business project, and secondly and most importantly, it depends on the rate of interest. The expected profitability of the business project will depend on the expected demand about the product that will be produced from this project over the entire lifetime of the project. Now once again, this expectation will depend on the different exogenous factors, and if the exogenous factors change, then the expectation will be subject to some adjustment either in the upward direction or in the downward direction. Given the expected profitability of the business project, investment expenditure or investment demand, or the borrowing or the demand for loanable fund would depend negatively on the interest rate. We can explain this as follows. Now the firms can rank the different available investment projects in terms of the profit that these investment projects offer. The interest rate will appear as a borrowing cost from the point of view of the firm. So therefore, at the higher interest rate, the borrowing costs will be higher, so that relatively fewer projects would be profitable. As the interest rate falls, the borrowing cost will also fall. So more and more projects would be profitable. Hence, the firm will be accepting more and more investment projects so that the investment increases. So that makes investment or borrowing or the demand for loanable fund a negative function of the interest rate. This is shown in the diagram. As the rate of interest falls, investment or borrowing by the firms will be rising. On the demand side of the bond market, there are individual savers. They buy bonds and hence they supply the loanable fund. In the classical model or any other macro model, individuals will not usually spend their entire amount of income to purchase the consumer goods. Therefore, individuals will have some excess of income over consumption expenditure. In the classical model, a saver can manage this excess of income over consumption expenditure in three ways. Firstly, he may add to his cash balance so that this money may be kept idle with him. However, this is a less favored alternative. It is true that some money will be held for the convenience and security it offered, but money in the classical model is completely barren. It yields no return. So therefore, bonds are most preferred alternative where the money may be kept so that it will be saved. Now, the classicals pointed out that wealth may be shifted into money, particularly during the times of economic distress, or if people anticipate that there will be some economic distress to be coming in future. However, this is a purely temporary phenomenon. Therefore, in the classical model, most of the savers will purchase bonds, which is an alternative place of investment that will be yielding returns. Thirdly, the individual may be an entrepreneur himself so that the excess fund may be used to purchase capital goods directly. Now, this is done by relatively few savers in the classical model, but in reality, this may be typical for a large group of savers. In the classical model, saving appears to be a positive function of rate of interest. This is quite different from the Keynesian model. In the Keynesian model, saving depends on the disposable income, and as disposable income, people spend more on saving, but the increase is less than proportionate. But in the classical model, why does saving depend on the rate of interest, and that too positively? The classical economists distinguished between current consumption and the future consumption. A saver will forego current consumption in order to have more consumption in future. The interest rate is the rate of return on saving. Therefore, as the interest rate rises, the trade-off becomes more favorable, so that the saver will be more interested to forego current consumption in order to get future consumption. Because in that case, if the interest rate rises, then for 1 unit of money invested now, the individual will be getting relatively higher amount of return in future. So that makes saving a positive function of rate of interest. In the diagram, the saving function or the lending function or the supply of loanable fund is drawn. So on the vertical axis we show the rate of interest, on the horizontal axis we show the saving, and the saving function is depicted as some upward rising function. Let us now consider the determination of interest rate in the classical model. Interest rate in the classical model is determined by the interaction of saving and investment, and it is determined in the market for loanable funds. This is not the case in the Keynesian model, where saving depends on the disposable income and investment depends inversely on the rate of interest. So that we get the ISLM model where the interest rate and the level of output or income is determined. Let us consider the diagram now. On the vertical axis we have measured the rate of interest, and on the horizontal axis we have shown saving, investment, and G minus T, which is the government deficit. The saving function or the supply of loanable fund or the lending function is shown as an upward rising function, whereas the investment function or the borrowing function or the demand for loanable fund function is drawn as a negatively sloped curve. The I equal to IR line shows the investment demand for the individual firms at different levels of interest rate. As mentioned earlier, government will also issue bond or they will demand the loanable fund if they want to finance their government deficit or their budget deficit by raising money through issuing of bonds. If we add I and G minus T, then that gives us total demand for loanable fund or total supply of bond in the bond market. At the point E0, the total saving or the total demand for bond or the total supply of loanable fund is equal to the total amount of bond issued in the market. It includes the government issue of bonds as well as the bond issued by the private firms. If we assume that the government budget is balanced so that we have only the demand for loanable funds created by the private firms, then the equilibrium will be attained at point E1, where the total saving will be exactly equal to the total investment by the private firms. In the classical model, this interest rate is perfectly flexible in either direction. For example, if the rate of interest is above R0, then there will be an excess demand for bonds, so that interest rate will automatically adjust downward until and unless S becomes equal to I. Similarly, if the rate of interest falls below R0, then total investment I plus G minus T will be more than the saving, so that there will be excess supply of bond or excess demand for loanable funds, so that the rate of interest will automatically adjust upward to reach R0, where once again S will be equal to I plus G minus T. For the market rate of interest to equate lending and borrowing or to equate saving and investment, two conditions are necessary to be fulfilled. Firstly, it is required that saving should be a direct function of the rate of interest, so that the savers will save more at higher rate of interest than at lower rate of interest, and the investors will be borrowing more at the lower rate of interest. The second necessary condition is that there should be, or rather there exists some rate of interest which is greater than 0, at which the amount saved will be equal to the amount invested. In other words, the saving and investment schedules should cut each other at some positive rate of interest. The second condition is fulfilled if the saving function and the investment functions are sufficiently interest elastic. Some argue that the condition may be assured if one of the two curves is interest elastic while the other is completely interest inelastic. Later on we shall be showing that what happens if the saving and the investment functions are indeed interest inelastic. The level of the equilibrium rate of interest would depend on the slope and relative position of the saving and the investment schedules also. Now, the more thrifty the population is, the lower will be the rate, and greater the marginal productivity of capital, the higher would be the rate of interest. In equilibrium, in fact, the rate of interest would be equal to the marginal productivity of capital as well as the marginal rate of time preference. Now we shall be considering the stabilizing role of interest rate in the classical model. For this we consider a hypothetical case where the expected profitability of investment changes. So initially the equilibrium is given at point O, where the initial level of saving is 0 and initial level of investment I0 intersect each other, so that the rate of interest is R0 and the saving investments are given as S0 and I0. Now we assume that due to some exogenous factor, the expected profitability of investment is reduced, so that the impact will be a reduction in investment at all levels of rate of interest. Therefore, the demand for loanable fund will be reduced for each level of interest rate. The investment curve shifts from I0 to I1. Here we are assuming that the government budget is balanced, so that G minus T is equal to 0, so that loanable fund is demanded only by the private firms in the economy. We have then only the I curve and not I plus G minus T curve as we considered earlier. In the diagram, the reduction in investment is shown by the distance OM. After the decline in investment at the initial rate of interest R0, there is some excess supply of loanable fund, as saving is greater than investment, or there is excess demand for bond since saving is greater than investment. As the supply of loanable fund exceeds the demand for loanable fund, then that will push some downward pressure on the interest rate, so that interest rate falls to R1, so that saving falls, investment falls to S1 and I1 respectively. Let us now elaborate on this impact of investment decline. As the interest rate declines, there will be two adjustments occurring in the economy. Firstly, the saving would decline, thus the consumption would increase. The fall in saving and the resultant increase in the consumption expenditure is shown by the distance ON in the diagram, which is nothing but the difference between S0 and S1. As the investment curve shifts towards left, the investment declines, and this is given by the point M. Now, as the interest rate is revised downward to R1, then this investment will revive to some extent. This revival in investment following the downward revision in the interest rate is shown by the distance Mn. So as the investment function shifts towards left and the new equilibrium is attained at interest rate R1, then there is some increase in the consumption expenditure which is given by ON, and some revival in investment which is given by Mn. So this Mn plus NO or the increase in consumption expenditure plus some revival in the investment expenditure would be just equal to the original autonomous decline in investment demand, which is given by the distance OM in the figure. So, because of the adjustment in the interest rate, the sum of the private sector demand, that is C plus I, would remain unaffected by the autonomous decline in the investment demand. In that way, the interest rate plays a very crucial stabilizing role in the classical model. Once again, the stabilizing role of the interest rate will be determined by the slopes of the saving and investment schedule, as well as it will depend on the shapes and positions of the two functions. The classical economists pointed out that there will be self-adjusting mechanisms operating in an economy so that full employment will always be guaranteed in the classical model. In fact, the classical economists offered two lines of defense so as to ensure the full employment level of output in the model. The labor market will always be in equilibrium at the natural rate of employment. Let us now consider these two lines of defense in a bit detail. The first line of defense for full employment in the classical model lies in the perfect flexibility of the interest rate. Now, if the interest rate is perfectly flexible, then shocks to the consumption expenditure, investment demand, or the government expenditure will not affect the aggregate demand. So, even if these components of aggregate demand change, the aggregate demand curve will not shift either towards left or towards right. So, given the aggregate supply curve, output will not change. If it is already fixed at the full employment level, then the full employment level of output will always be produced. Now, what happens if this first line of defense fails? So that the aggregate demand shifts when one or more of its component changes. There is a second line of defense for full employment in the classical model, and that lies in the wage price flexibility. The wage price flexibility ensures that the labor market will always be cleared at the natural rate of employment and the aggregate supply curve is vertical at the full employment level. So, even if the aggregate demand changes, there would be no impact on the level of output. So, irrespective of the level of aggregate demand curve, the full employment level of output will always be produced in the classical model. Classical model asserts that the output will always be at the full employment level. But what is the guarantee that this much of output will actually be sold? So, for a given level of output produced and supplied, what is the guarantee that there will be enough aggregate demand so that the producers will be able to sell the entire amount of output that they will be producing? A debate thus arose in the early 19th century. Can there be any general overproduction or glut in a market economy? The answer is no, as is assured by Say's law, which states that supply creates its own demand. So, if goods are produced, there will automatically be a market for those. The law owes its origin to a French economist, J.B. Say, and this is one of the two important pillars on which the classical model rests. The one is, as we have already considered, the quantity theory of money, and the other is the Say's law of market. But what is the guarantee that supply will always create its own demand? The Say's law is always true in a barter economy. Now, working is definitely unpleasant, but people work to earn the wages and to get goods and services that they require. In a Robinson Crusoe type economy, the people obtain these goods and services directly through their own effort. But in an economy characterized by presence of division of labor and exchange, people will produce only those goods that they can produce most efficiently. They will consume a part of their produce, and the surplus over their consumption will be exchanged for goods that the other peoples are producing. Production therefore creates demand for other goods. Moreover, this demand made by one particular individual will be once again equal to the value of the surplus goods produced by others in the economy. Therefore, in the barter economy, the aggregate demand will always be equal to the aggregate supply. Now, it is often noted by the economists that at some point in time, people might prefer to have some leisure hour. So, they might prefer to work a little less, and they will be sacrificing a little amount of good than they could buy in exchange. This unemployment, as is mentioned by the classical economists, would be voluntary rather than involuntary. So that this unemployment or people having preference for some extra leisure hour will be a temporary phenomenon. Now, one thing we should keep in mind that Say's law is different from the definitional identity among the national income, national product and the total expenditure. This identity holds true for any level of income output and expenditure. But Say's law implies that any increase in output would create an equivalent increase in income and spending. So, income and output can always be at the full employment level. In case output is less than the full employment level, some resources will be involuntarily unemployed. So, if production is increased, an equivalent amount of income would always be generated, which in turn will be used to purchase the additional output produced. Additional output will be produced until the full employment is reached. However, one thing should be made clear that the output produced by an individual might not match the demand of others in the market. For example, a producer might take some potatoes in the market, but at the going barter terms of trade may find less demand for it. Thus, his potatoes may purchase, say, less flour than he had anticipated. So, there would be a glut of potatoes or overproduction of potatoes. This, however, only a temporary phenomenon in the classical model. This producer can react by producing relatively lesser amount of potatoes, or they can enjoy more leisure hour, or they can produce some other commodities which have demand in the going barter terms of trade. Thus, in a barter economy, individuals would supply a commodity or a service in the market only to demand another commodity or service, so that the Say's law will always be true in a barter economy. But this is not so obvious if goods and services are sold for the money. Then what happens if the economy is using money? Now, this is not at all a problem in the classical model. We have already seen that money is a whale in the classical model, of course under certain conditions. The money is affecting only the nominal variable, the real output and real employment will be affected by the real factors. Behind the veil, everything operated thus in the same way as if all exchanges took the form of the barter. While the Say's law holds good in an economy using money, some other questions might be raised which will create some confusion about holding of Say's law in real life situations. One such case is when production is organized by the entrepreneurs or the larger firms. The elementary form of Say's law was in terms of a one-person firm or a family firm that uses their own capital and land and labor to produce a final product. This final product is sold to another similar firm or a household that consumes it. In real life situation, The firms usually hire the labor and they buy other factors of production to produce final products as well as intermediate goods that are sold to the direct consumers as well as to the other firms. Now, in this situation, will Say's law hold true when the production is organized by the entrepreneurs who are not producing only the final good? Now, the classical economists had some answer to this problem. Under perfect competition and perfect wage price flexibility, output would always be maintained at the full employment, so that the aggregate supply curve is vertical and the quantity of money would determine the price level at which the full employment output may be sold. So therefore the problem is solved and the Say's law would hold even if the production is organized by large firms who produce final goods as well as some intermediate goods. Further criticism was raised against the Say's law, and the question was raised that does Say's law hold when the individuals save and invest? Say's law was operating in an economy where the producer-consumers interact among themselves in a market with consumer goods only. The entire income is spent on the consumer goods. However, in real life cases, individuals may not spend their entire income to purchase consumer goods. They might want to save that excess amount of money, or they may be investing in the capital goods, so that the part that is saved does not create any demand for final goods. So under the situation, the question arises, does Say's law hold when individuals save and invest? The classical economists had some answer to offer that will ensure that the Say's law will hold even with saving and investment. The classical theory of saving, investment and interest rate determination suggests that interest rate is perfectly flexible and it plays a stabilizing role in the classical system. Through the wage price flexibility, the labor market is always in equilibrium and the aggregate supply curve is vertical. Now we suppose that to start with, saving is greater than investment, so that there is excess demand for bond in the bond market. The Walra law would imply that there would be excess supply in the goods market, because here we have three markets: the goods market, labor market and the market for loanable fund. The labor market is always in equilibrium, and if we have excess demand for bond in the bond market or excess supply of loanable fund in the market for loanable fund, then there should be excess supply in the goods market. The interest rate is perfectly flexible in either direction, so that when saving is greater than investment, the interest rate would instantaneously fall to equate saving and investment. Therefore, the bond market once again comes back to equilibrium. Therefore, the excess supply in the goods market will be automatically corrected. Now, the reverse process will be operating if, to start with, saving is less than investment. So, in that case, there will be excess supply of bond in the bond market, and the Walra law would imply that there will be excess demand in the goods market. So the interest rate would rise instantaneously to equate S and I. The bond market will come back to the equilibrium, and the excess demand in the goods market will be automatically corrected. So the wage price flexibility and the interest rate flexibility in the classical model will ensure that the Say's law will always be true when the individuals are saving and investing. So the interest rate flexibility will ensure that the bond market will always be in equilibrium, And the wage price flexibility will imply that the labor market is always in equilibrium. So therefore the goods market will always be in equilibrium. We can explain it in some other way also. All the income earned through the process of production will be spent. The recipient of the income may not themselves spend it all on the consumer goods because they are savers, so that a part will be saved. But since they will not hold their excess income in form of idle money balances, they will be saving using some asset that yields a positive yield. Now the rate of interest will automatically adjust to always equate saving with investment. At the equilibrium interest rate, then there will be some investor who will want to spend precisely the amount that the saver did not spend. Therefore, all of the income earned from the production of any output will be completely respent on the current output. So the supply will be creating its own demand. Therefore, in the classical model, the Say's law will always be holding true as long as the wages and prices are fully flexible and the interest rate is fully flexible. The wage price flexibility ensures that the full employment output will always be produced even if production is organized by farms who are not just single owner farms or family farms. Further, the interest rate flexibility ensures that the full employment level of output will be purchased either as the consumer goods or as the capital goods. The analysis thus far have pointed toward some important results of the classical model. First of all, the full employment will always be guaranteed in the classical model. Forces or there will be self-adjusting tendencies operating within the economy that will ensure the full employment in the classical model. So there will be two lines of defense ensured by the interest rate flexibility and the wage price flexibility. Full employment will always be guaranteed and supply will be creating its own demand, so that this amount of output will always be sold in the market. There will be no general overproduction or glut in the market economy. Further, money is neutral or money is veil in a classical system. So the quantity of money affects only the prices. It doesn't have any impact on the real variables such as output and the employment. Output and employment will be basically supply determined. So we find a strict dichotomy between the real sector and the monetary sector in the classical model. The real output, real employment will be determined in the real sector by the real factors, particularly the supply side factors, whereas the quantity of money will be determining only the price level. In the coming lecture videos, we shall be talking about the policy effectiveness in the classical model, whether the fiscal policy and the monetary policy will be effective in the classical framework. And then we shall be moving on to the problems of the classical model. So till then, bye. Have a good day.